So, hi guys. Um, so this week we should cover the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestine issue. But I have to give like a makeup lecture to make up for the one we missed because of the storm, the second one of week 6. So I'll cover first like Bahrain and Morocco as promised in some detail as part of the endurance of absolutism in the Arab region and especially in the monarchies, and how Bahrain and Morocco would stand out for something different. That's why we need to closely examine in some detail. And then perhaps at the most tomorrow I'll upload another link for the first lecture on Palestine, and then on Thursday the one on we will continue with the Palestine issue, especially the Oslo agreements and the peace settlements, after we cover the origins of Zionism and the obstacles of state building in Palestine. So let's go first into let's cover the remaining two states as part of the monarchies in the region, and then we can I'll make some announcement regarding the grades of your movie review, and perhaps Zoom meeting or virtual office hours. So after we cover like this story of state building in the region, and we cover like the authoritarian regimes in the authoritarianism or the one dominant party systems in the Republican regimes, and then the Gulf monarchies and the story of the dynastic families, and then I mentioned something about Bahrain and Morocco as Bahrain every now and then witnessed kind of political uprising or political demonstrations, and it has like different kind of demographic composition, with minority Sunni dominated the political governance and the political landscape, and marginalized the majority of Shia. And Morocco as well, like it's kind of constitutional monarchy that had like very distinct, very unique feature of the political regime, like multi-party system, and the king actually used in order to enhance and to enhance his dominant position, instead of putting or intensifying pressures on the monarchy. It actually helped the king in order to perpetuate his own rule. It's kind of divide and rule strategy. So actually it's Bahrain had kind of it could stand out for something different, as kind of kind of a different trajectory of socioeconomic transformation. It was a story of political accommodation to radical social and economic transformation after the 1930s, especially after the oil discovery, and even before, under the imperial power and the relationship with Britain, and even before gaining independence and full independence from the British power. It had some foundation of a strong state. So three interrelated and interlinked developments happened after the end of the Second World War that gradually eroded the power base of the imperial order. Firstly, it was kind of an extension of the central administration. So it laid the groundwork for a strong state. Or it's like essential step for state building that happened in other Gulf monarchies after gaining independence, except for Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned. But it spent some time in order to modernize the country, and it took it took years for Al Saud House in order to modernize the country. So, firstly, like the state managed to extend its central administration in order to supervise or to have like to tighten its control over some economic and social activities. So it gained a kind of unprecedented degree of state control over the operations of different commercial and industrial enterprises. Um, and then like the expansion of foreign firms as well uh, gave rise to like important or increased the number of merchant houses that actually they were merchant class was kind of better connected and managed to consolidate its power in the face of and it gained control over the foreign trading sector that enhanced its position as a class in the face of the ruling family. So it had like some sort of class power and establishment of like a strong or a central administrative structure, and then especially after like the discovery of the oil and after lifting some restrictions on the immigration of skilled workers. So it actually these kind of developments and the economic transformation gave rise to a large number of South Asian workers inside the country and leave the immigration of skilled workers. Um, so these kind of dynamics and the interaction between and this actually undermined the emergence of it offered kind of a challenge to the dominant position and the monopoly of the merchant class community, especially after like um, the Bahrain Petroleum Company kind of undermined its monopolistic position, the merchant monopolistic community position that occupied all the market operations or transactions. So these kind of three interrelated factors or processes, they actually gave rise to vibrant liberal nationalist movement during the early 50s. It was kind of unsuccessful movement, but or kind of it was a movement of a limited success, but it left the regime actually vulnerable to more radical kind of demands and radical opponents by the mid 50s or throughout the 50s. So these kind of developments and the emergence of liberal nationalist movements and the kind of reactionary attitude from like different sectarian forces, like they offered like they shaped the political dynamics in Bahrain, and this would help like with interpreting some developments in the country after gaining independence. So some would consider Bahrain as kind of paradigmatic case of political non-revolutionary development, despite this kind of radical and profound social and economic transformations after the 1930s. So what happened, like the discovery of the oil, it changed the dominance and the position of different classes and the prominence of economic activities that actually affected more villagers, the people in the rural areas, because of like it undermined actually the agricultural sector. So it affected the everyday life of poor people in villages. So it became like it offered like more conducive environment for the emergence of political opposition that had like some sort of social and economic grievances to challenge the ruling family. But the effect was like less prone, kind of obvious in northern and eastern coastal areas, because actually fishing it did continue to provide for or to provide some sort of employment and some goods for local populations. And the merchant class and the commercial interests actually remained largely unaffected by these developments. They managed to maintain their kind of powerful class position, and economic emanated mainly from um, their economic activities. And during, parallel to these kind of social and economic transformations, the ruling family managed to use effectively the revenues of the oil in order to enhance or to establish this kind of central administration, and to undertake, these kind of modernization measures very early, even before gaining the independence from the imperial power, and to establish as well, like, police forces, in order not only to offer, like, kind of security by training, by offering kind of training programs, and offering modern, some sort of modern equipment, in order to like to force law and order. And it managed actually to establish this kind of police forces, but it managed actually to get kind of penetration to interior or outlying districts in order to enhance the obedience and the compliance of different tribes. So these kind of police forces and training programs and security training programs, actually it didn't only regulate kind of like the flow of arms, to different tribes in the country, but also it managed to foster, the ties between Al Khalifa, the ruling family, and many tribes in the country. So it had like a heritage and the legacy of assuming, the role of strong state even before gaining independence, or even like, with the intervention of Britain as, like, the most influential imperial power in the region back then. So again, like the deterioration of the agricultural sector and the it's not like, the privileges the merchant class, had and managed to retain. It helped them in order to transform their economic and social basis, and these kind of socioeconomic power into organizational structure. So they had their own chamber of commerce in 1939, and it helped them to enhance their organizational capacity and to ask for more kind of political participation in decision-making process. And these things like developed, and they played important and important role in the liberal nationalist movement in the 1951, and they asked actually for more meaningful, like, political participation channels in decision making. So the state tried, to especially during the Second World War, in order to organize, or to enhance its control over economic activities and different social interests, especially with the emergence of black market and the accumulation of wealth and profits from for the part of different black marketeers. So the state managed actually to issue some of laws and regulations in order to organize and to regulate, these kind of trading practices, but it didn't actually preclude these the merchant classes or merchant groups from accumulating wealth and getting around, these regulations and legal frameworks. And it had, like, kind of a legacy of labor strikes as well, especially with the Bahrain Petroleum Company, and but the state managed actually to regulate even the workers' affairs by establishing this kind of labor committee. So actually, regardless of, like, these kind of important social and economic position of the merchant class, and some sort of labor activism in Bahrain that like it didn't happen, elsewhere in the Gulf area. So the state managed to prevail over these kind of social forces and emerged as the most dominant or the dominant component of the ruling coalition during the until the late 40s. So these kind of development actually eroded the basis of the imperial power, but it didn't actually affect it negative. It didn't affect the position of the ruling family or the emir in Bahrain. But it paved the way for the emergence of the liberal nationalist movement. But the state actually or the ruling family managed to suppress the movement. So it was like a story of emergence, like of some sort of cycles of mobilization, like over years. But it didn't actually undermine the political position or the legitimate position of Al Khalifa as like a ruling family in Bahrain. So it had like during that period, like late 30s and early 40s, it was like a smaller, some of the merchant groups like Sunni and Shia, they had their own kind of organizational structure or cultural societies. They started to form their own kind of centers or cultural centers in order to deliberate or in order to exchange ideas. So the most famous ones, they were like Nadi al-Bahrain and Nadi al-Uruba. These actually were centers mainly for Arab nationalist sentiments. So they managed to draw together like different nationalist elements in order to support or to channel their nationalist cause. This actually triggered like some reactionary attitudes for the part of Al Khalifa and other like sectarian forces. For example, like Al Khalifa, they had their own like Islah Association. It was kind of a state-sponsored association, something like Nadi or to countervail or to offset, the existence of these Nadi al-Bahrain and Nadi al-Uruba. So the main target was actually to channel, these kind of upward mobility of upward mobility of the young Shia into less politically charged pursuits. And like other like Ferdowsi cultural and sports club as well, they had like the same target or the same purpose in order to lighten up these kind of nationalist sentiments. So they had like close ties with the state, and they tried to tune out these kind of nationalist sentiments. And in addition to these associations and clubs, like the majority of Shia, they had like this tradition of Ma'tam houses in order to commemorate the Ashura, like to commemorate the shahada or the death of Imam Hussein. So it functioned as like kind of informal associations, especially for the prominent urban traders, and they had like close ties with the state association, especially with the Waqf. So it actually, these kind of houses reinforced the position of the Shia commercial and religious bourgeoisie or religious oligarchy. And they had like to organize it triggered some other movement from like small towns in order to organize their like faction oriented houses or like family organizations in smaller towns and cities. And this actually enhanced or reinforced this kind of sectarian elements amongst the Shia groups. but still, like, the Shia young merchants, they had, like, these kind of clubs or nawadis in order to use as kind of political fora, or to articulate, their political grievances against the regime, and it offered kind of space for them in order to coordinate the efforts to challenge the colonial power and Al Khalifa to some extent. Um, so this actually gave rise to the liberal nationalist movement. After the state actually re-established its control over commercial affairs by imposing, some duties and customs. So this triggered, some challenging attitudes from the merchant class against the state. So that's why they had, to organize themselves in order to defend their own interest and to advance, their own interest. And this, like, again, like, coincided with the discovery of the oil and lifting restrictions on labor immigrations. So that's why some moderate representatives of the new classes, the rich classes, they started to advocate more kind of reform, to ask for more reform measures. It happened actually firstly in 1947, 1948, and it was logical because of the UN resolution of the partition of Palestine, and then the war in Palestine in 1948. So different forces actually tried to organize themselves. The petroleum company, the workers, actually they organized themselves into a national front in order to advance, this patriotic struggle for independence. And they called upon, like, different forces, workers, like merchants and notables, in order to get together in order to defend, the independence cause. But actually, it didn't manage to. The movement actually failed to gain, like, wide mass support. So that's why this liberal content actually overturned or overtaken by different kind of sectarian conflict. And it happened in 1952 when the working classes started to mobilize along sectarian line. Firstly, they asked for more representation in the local council in Manama, and it talked, like, this kind of sectarian content. And this actually led to the eruption of the sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia, led to clashes, that prevailed the country in 1953 between, like, during, like, the day of Ashura. So the mourners, they got attacked by Sunni onlookers, and then this triggered, like, more cycle of violence in different areas in Bahrain, and this, like, the spiral of sectarian conflict started to continue. So some efforts tried to re-emerge in order to like to absorb, these kind of or to channel these sectarian clashes, and to channel them into less kind of non-sectarian channel, in order to find kind of a common goal in order to converge on, or in order to push for more kind of common interest. So some of the Arab nationalist activists, they actually called for a general strike, and they asked, like, notables from, like, both communities to support their effort in order to advance this nationalist cause. And some, like, the members of the National Assembly, they selected, like, 8 members, like 4 Sunni and 4 Shia, in order to form or to establish a higher executive committee. And it was like a manifestation of this kind of intercommunal cooperation between the Sunni and the Shia. and they had like the committee offered like a reform proposal in order to elect, the legislative body, and to form trade unions of with kind of a court of appeals. And of course, like the emir, and it continued even after the independence, rejected, any kind of electoral basis or electoral foundation of the regime. Um, so like during the same year, 1953, new round of protests erupted in order to and asked for actually more political reforms, and it actually obliged the emir to get to the negotiation table and to offer kind of concession in 1954. And then he offered the concession to the commission, to the higher executive commission, by making an agreement, and they agreed on, like, holding these kind of municipal elections. But the commission actually failed to agree on specific candidates or to field candidates for the elections, but it managed, to draw up a plan regarding the formation of the trade unions, and it actually it managed to fend off any attempt by the regime to implant, some supporters, some of the regime supporters inside the commission, and it gained kind of legal and official recognition, and undermined, any trial to undermine its autonomy, and it established its own, like, legal body. It called like Committee of National Unity. It was like in charge of like legal engineering and any kind of legal formation of or the legal foundation of the committee, or the trade unions or affiliate bodies. But again, like, this kind of liberal nationalist movement, it faced some kind of radical challenges as well. So some people, like, it was hard for the movement to attract, some radical segments in the society. So some other, like, associations or organizational efforts emerged in order to foster these kind of sectarian feeling. And actually, even from within the commission and its legal body, the CNU, it was like, the criticism started to grow, actually, and it went out of the commission's hands. So that's why the radical wing inside the CNU actually started, to criticize Britain, and started to articulate, different kind of radical nationalist discourse, and to call for more kind of direct action and more violent action against, imperial authority. And some of the Jafari League emerged as well. It was like it made up or composed of low level of employees and some believers in grassroots actions. So that's why things like went out of the control of like moderate and liberal figures, and the eruption of riots erupted in 1956, and it coincided with the tripartite attack, or the invasion of Britain, France, and Israel in Egypt. So they actually seized the opportunity in order to radicalize the political landscape, or to articulate or to advance their own demands. But actually, the state or the regime or the emir, with like his police forces and central kind of strong administration, managed to suppress the nationalist movement. So what helped with that? It was like Bahrain actually by then, like, it went like far with the modernization. It had like its own like administrative structure or administrative central administrative structure and police forces that actually helped a lot with the quelling and putting down the popular uprisings. And the police forces actually managed to gain the loyalty and the support of the tribal population. So the radical forces or the liberal nationalist movements or the radical nationalist groups, they didn't actually or movements, they didn't actually manage to attract supporters from like remote or tribal population. They didn't have like wide support base, from tribal population. And then the Bahrain Petroleum Company as well managed to neutralize any kind of political opposition came from local business groups by allowing the business in order to supply kind of goods or foodstuffs and other goods to the company's local plants. So it actually didn't threaten its, like, the merchants, monopolistic, position or the local business interest. So that's why it eroded, the basis or the social basis of the nationalist movements in Bahrain. So by actually the mid 1950s, the ruling family or the ruling coalition managed to reconstitute itself in Bahrain and to reestablish the state control over society. And it offered like more concessions and allowed for a monopoly for the commercial elites or commercial groups in order to kind of to co-opt them into acquiescence. So it offered like more favorable economic regulations that allowed for or it gave more free space to the merchant groups to manage their own activities without the interference from the state. And it actually managed to deflate these kind of any kind of political activities into economic ones. So what happened was kind of more reorientation of efforts away from like political demands to more economic demands. And the state managed to regulate the labor movements and the workers activities as well. So instead of like being articulated or managed by like external or outsider or external organizations like the High Commission, for example, it had to be through like the commissions related or affiliated or state sponsored kind of committees. And it was considered kind of like any kind of issue related any kind of issues related to workers' complaints or grievances, they have to be dealt, on internal basis by like these kind of commissions. So actually, the state, like, despite the fact of like the existence of like liberal and radical nationalist movements, the state managed to reestablish and reconstitute its power, and it became like much easier for the state after gaining independence in the early 70s after the referendum. So it was like much easier to continue with the same like pattern of rule that happened like before the independence period. So it was kind of pattern continued in Bahrain after gaining independence. So it had like its own constitution in 1973. And according to this constitution, it stipulated like the establishment of like representative assembly or legislative assembly of 44 members, including the members of the cabinet and more 31s. What happened? They gave it a try, and like two main oppositional blocs dominated the assembly during its first year, like the Shia villagers or rural Shia groups, and nationalist. And that nationalist, it like the group actually or the movement It had like Sunni and Shia elements, so it's kind of cross-sectional movement. And they didn't actually threaten or impose any kind of credible threat on Al Khalifa, but like the ruling family decided, to shut down um, the parliament or the council after the government actually lost vote on restrictive public security law. Effectively, the Al Khalifa didn't need, without, getting, this kind of law or legal, foundation in order to suppress opposition, because, the family or the regime, like, it was able, to do it anyway, without any kind of legal pretext to do that. But again, like, it was like, something perhaps deeply, like, ingrained, in their culture. Like, they didn't want to pay this kind of low cost of power sharing, or to have even, like, low level of parliamentary oversight. So it was like they didn't want to have like this electoral foundation of the regime, despite the fact that, the police or the state apparatuses, are, or like, they have been capable of like suppressing uh, ruthlessly any kind of opposition. But yeah, it's perhaps, this is the only reason why the idea, like, of creating or having, this kind of legislative, or parliament, or legislative council never, like, fully implemented or applied in Bahrain. As we are going to see, even like, after Saudi had its own like council, um, even like, to allow for moderate and or window dressing kind of opposition, Bahrain still, like, they didn't want to have, like, to pay, this low cost of power sharing. um, so he put an end, like, to this kind of parliamentary life, and like the ruling family didn't want to have, like, this kind of even, like, meaningless forum, for opposition to vocalize, kind of different opinions. But again, like, it's still like before the Iranian Revolution, the political opposition was kind of it had, like, cross-sectarian element, so it was very difficult to speak of, like, monolithic, Sunni bloc that supported, Al Khalifa all the way through, and even after. But before the Iranian Revolution, the opposition, even, like, within, like, Shia community, it was like kind of either leftist or nationalist opposition. So they didn't ask for, like, overthrowing, the Al Khalifa, or they didn't impose any kind of threat on Al Khalifa's rule. So after the Iranian Revolution, so some other, like, organizations started to emerge, inspired by the Shia or the Iranian revolution. So the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain actually emerged in 1981, and it had, like, a plan to overthrow, like, Al Khalifa, or to take over power. And Al Khalifa managed to suppress, or to put an end to this movement, and they pretended, as if nothing happened, and they didn't, like, make a big fuss about, this failed attempt to overthrow or to take the coup attempt to take over power. And then in 1996, what happened, it was kind of mass demonstrations, or wide, social unrest and riots, with, like, the Shia majority from villages still, like, the kind of formed um, like threatening force, or challenging force in the face of Al Khalifa. Actually, the Sunni didn't participate in any kind of violent event against the government. So, but and actually, some of the Sunni supported without even participating in these kind of violent actions. They signed petitions in order to support, some of the Shia Shia demands. Um, so again, like, it's very hard um, to deal, like, with the Sunni as, like, coherent bloc that they support, Al Khalifa in the face of, or in its the family in its confrontation with the Shia. In the uprisings, we're going to talk more about, the eruption of the uprising and the role of Saudi Arabia in quelling, the Shia forces. So again, in 1992, after, like, inspired by, Saudi Arabia, when it had, like, its appointed uh, consultation council. So the ruling family in Bahrain tried to draw, like, moderate oppositions in order to isolate villagers. The Shia threat, came from, or, like, has come from rural areas. But again, like, it was never kind of fully implemented, because again, perhaps the preference of Al Khalifa, knowing that, like, everything, especially, like, with the existence of Saudi Arabia and the intervention of Saudi Bahrain, in Bahrain. So it offered kind of more kind of layer of safety or security for Al Khalifa to intervene, at any time in order to put down any kind of popular uprising, if things, like, went out of control or out of their hands. But actually, the ruling family there, didn't want to have, like, to increase, this kind of regional influence, especially that it's some sort kind of dependent on Saudi Arabia, and they didn't have, like, the same economic leverage, like other oil-rich countries in the Gulf. So they needed, actually, again, to perhaps to decrease or to reduce the role of Saudi in Bahrain. Yeah, so it's a story of, like, the existence of, like, Saudi Arabia, and the inclination to intervene in Bahrain at any time in order to secure or to save Al Khalifa, as actually it happened, after, the eruption of the uprisings in Bahrain, and Saudi military aid and military forces managed to put down, the popular uprising. And we will talk more about this when we tackle, the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2010, 2011. For Morocco, it was actually, if you remember, like, when we talked about, like, North Africa, the emergence of state building or the post-colonial state. So we hinted at the nationalist movement and the political legitimacy in 19 at the time of dependence in 1956. It was, like, unlike Tunisia, for example, when the new Destroyer Party managed in 3 years, to wipe out, any kind of political competitors or political rivals. The Istiqlal Party and its leader Al Fasi didn't manage, to gain, this kind of mass popular support, and to gain, like, kind of control over the party. So at the time of after gaining independence, what happened, it was, like, so many factions started to emerge within the Istiqlal Party, between the constitutionalist or the constitutional old guards and the young radicals. So they had, like, a different mindset and different strategies, um, about, like, the how to deal with the king, how to deal with the current regime, how to establish kind of a new polity structure. So it was, like, it did split between, like, different, smaller parties, like the National Union of Popular Forces, and actually some other factions, started to break away, from or to break with the popular forces as well, especially trade unionists, inspired by Mahdi bin Baraka, that it had like the potential to be Habib Bourguiba, but it didn't manage to have like this wide mass support or ideological indoctrination or ideological education in order to attract wide masses to his side. And then the Democratic Party of Independence, that actually rejected what its leaders called like the fascist policies or the fascist attitude of the Istiqlal Party, and it mainly draw like some traditional or traditionalist forces from rural areas. And then the Barber, they had their own popular movement party. The was founded in 1957, and actually the king recognized, the party a year after in 1958. So Muhammad V emerged as like the only independent figure or the main arbitrator between these political parties. So this kind of multi-party structure actually served um, the king in order to entrench or to consolidate his own power. So this kind of multi-party structure or this kind of like institutional setting actually reflected or mirrored the country's subcultures as well, because like it was very difficult to speak of like one kind of coherent cultural trend in the country. So the you can see like different parties that represented different social groups or different subcultures, like rural traditionalist, PDI, like conservative or conventionalist, Islamic bourgeoisie, some of them like the constitutional old guards, and some other like intellectuals and trade unionists, for example, that they established their own like fronts, and they worked from outside the existing polity structure. So it actually it remained like one of the most important feature of the Moroccan political system, this kind of multipartism, and how it served actually this divide and rule strategy uh, of the monarchy as an institution in order to perpetuate and to consolidate its power. So in kind of in Waterbury's terms, he called this kind of segmented elite structure, and how the king actually usually orchestrate these kind of segmented system by gaining actually some traditional elements and some modern elements as well. So the king actually enjoyed these kind of traditional bonds because of the religious lineage. So it had like kind of religious legitimacy, and by establishing kind of a modern state, so it added like one more modernized element or aspect to his regime, and he actually controlled the access to the administration, and the distribution of royal favors, including ministerial posts in the cabinet, and it had like it has kind of control over the military, despite the fact of like two failed coup attempts happened in the 70s, early 70s. But actually he had like the king had control over the coercive apparatuses in Morocco. So it was like kind of smooth task by like developing kind of the institution or establishing the constitution, the institution of the monarchy. So he gradually prepared Hassan II, the crown prince, to assume power after his death. So it was easy after his sudden death, Muhammad V. He took over power. He assumed power. Hassan II assumed power without facing any kind of resistance from different institutions or different political forces in Morocco. And he managed, to rally or to draw together, different radical groups and establish the Royal Armed Forces as, like, the military establishment in the monarchy, in the country. And then the cabinet, the council of ministers. But he didn't actually have, like, any inherited, like, civilian administration, and that's why he had, like, to establish this, from kind of scratch. So after, like, after the death of Muhammad the fifth, Hassan the second, like, assumed power, and he invited all the parties except, like, the popular forces, the UNFP, to write the constitution. And actually, the constitution gives kind of wide emergency authority power to the king, and extensive, actually, prerogatives, to the king. But it as well, like, admitted or offered, kind of collective responsibility of ministers to popularly elected House of Representatives. So they had, like, kind of representative body. And this kind of House of Representatives, it has, like, kind of supervisory power. So that's why he created kind of parliamentary life in Morocco. So the constitution got approved and ratified in 1962, and it actually did acknowledge, the religious position or the symbolic position of the king as the commander of the faithful, and he actually the supreme representative of the nation. So it retain the constitution actually safeguards this kind of traditional element or the traditional base of legitimacy for the king, and the king actually retained, the this legitimate base in order to legitimize his rule. And he created actually his own kind of unofficial party, and it was called the Front for the Defense Constitutional Institution. And the constitutional the Front for the Defense constitutional institutions, with a coalition of the popular movements and PDI, they managed, to get some seats in the first legislative, body, the House of Representatives. But what happened? It was the opposition, including Istiqlal and the Popular Front. They gained, like, 69 seats. So that's why it was kind of alarming or threatening indicator to the king. And what happened after, like, in 1965, the eruption of wide student protest in Casablanca, like, led by the Union of Moroccan Students and joined by workers. So these are still, like, they have been, like, the most, like, active social and political forces in Morocco, and the workers actually considered students as, like, a natural kind of ally to the workers' movements. So the eruption, of the wide mass protests and riots that, went out of hands in 1965 and led to, like, brutal crackdown, by the police and, like, some military forces, some military units as well. So it actually led to, it triggered, more violent actions against political opposition. Especially, it led to the assassination of Mahdi bin Baraka in France in the same year. And the Hassan II, the king, actually dissolved the parliament and suspended the constitution. And he didn't actually eliminate all aspects of parliamentary life, and he allowed for rigged elections in order to secure some seats for his own supporters, and in order not to have, like, kind of significant political opposition in the House of Representatives. And using his, like, wide authorities and extensive constitutional power, he undertook kind of constitutional amendments in 1967 in order to put more restrictions on political parties as kind of or any kind of mediating like trade unions and student associations or unions, any kind of mediating or social associations or organizations. And he explicitly kind of expressed this as like, I will never put into equation, like meaning like, he like, he had to be like, he had to prevail over, these kind of political parties and political forces. And that's why he needed, he had to restrict their functions or um, their political actions, using, again, his traditional and modern legitimacy in order to establish and re-establish bonds with the people, with the citizens, and to control over political elites. As I mentioned, because of the corruption and this kind of brutal and harsh crackdown and so many kind of like misuse or misallocation of resources in order to distribute material benefits and to acquire, loyalty and support from different, regime elements. So some of the loyal forces from the military and air forces, tried to take over power or to overthrow the king in 1970 and 1972, but he was lucky that, both attempts, failed actually, and he managed to sustain his power. So he actually tried, to recreate, the polity in 1973, because he was not able to sustain, this kind of iron, grip on power. So that's why he had to negotiate with the political oppositions and to bring political parties back into, this kind of political game, applying, the same technique of divide and rule by what the literature called like negotiated the structure of roles. Like even the opposition, it had to play kind of a role by playing, by legitimizing the regime and playing from within the boundaries set by the political regime in Morocco. So by inviting, some political parties, to share power within the institutional setting of the monarchy, this actually created or triggered, more factions and divisions within the political opposition, because it has been kind of never ending debate whether or not, to think pragmatically by accepting the offer of the king and participating in the political process, or playing from outside, the polity framework as an opposition. And this in this case actually they got deprived of the royal favors, because he is the king is like the one, in charge of distributing these kind of royal favors. So it actually it's a binary choice and a trade-off between accepting getting into or playing within the rules of the game, like set by the regime, or actually playing from outside the political structure, and then they got deprived of the royal favors, and more they would get like, some sort of mass support, or they didn't, this kind of political opposition doesn't alienate, their supporters or social base, but at the same time they didn't have access, to any kind of material benefits or the king's, patronage, new patrimonial kind of favors or networks. So playing, with the same tools, like inviting in like political opposition in order to participate in the decision making, in order to have like, some ministerial posts or some positions, in the cabinet, but at the same time this would create, more divisions and more alienation, of their social basis. And he actually had another card to play with. Uh, he actually grasped the at the opportunity in 1975 after the death of Franco, when he like announced like that like Spain, would remove its control over Western Sahara soon. So that's why the Hassan II, tried like to capitalize on this opportunity by taking kind of unilateral action and arranging this kind of green march by asking actually or mobilizing more than like 300 or 350,000 volunteers, only like armed with the Quran and these kind of green banners, in order to march, or to surge across the frontiers, in order to express, their deep belief that like Sahara, is part of the Moroccan, territory. By like this helped him to create what he called kind of sacred union. So he invited political opposition, including Istiklal, in order to take part in the government. So 1 year before, in 1974, Istiklal, for example, like set out a program on economic reforms and national integrity. And actually, the Istiklal Party, the leaders, like shifted the focus, shifted like this focus on economic and political reform demands after the Western Sahara issue, in order to support the king in his call for territorial recovery and the territorial integrity of Morocco. So actually, all political forces managed to like to get engaged, in or accepted, this call for sacred union, and they did abide by the rules of the king. But it actually, what happened, it was kind of this strategy backfired, because it triggered, some counter, or it actually the Polisario front actually formed, their own their own kind of guerrilla groups, and they deployed these kind of guerrilla techniques that prolonged, this military confrontation between Morocco and Polisario, and it ended up with the UN resolution in 76 that actually allowed Morocco to have kind of administrative authority over Sahara, but didn't like give Morocco sovereignty over the territory. It gave like Morocco and Mauritania, and then Mauritania, had to actually withdraw. So effectively, Morocco was a kind of a de facto, governor or administrator. But again, like the Polisario front, rejected, this kind of resolution, and it prolonged the confrontation with the king or with Morocco, and it continued, the spiral continued for years until 1980. 89, when the United Nations had like a ceasefire resolution and called for a referendum, and again Polisario refused, because they had like the term of having kind of referendum, because they asked for unconditional kind of independent and full independence. So it was like kind of issue, like it backfired, and the negotiations actually continued on until like recent years. So actually, he had to find another strategy in order to rally or to draw together different opposition forces. So he launched some economic measures of called Moroccanization, in order to kind of to have control the state. According to this program, the state had control over foreign owned lands and many kind of private enterprises, and it had like kind of limited program in order to respond to some leftist demands. So the state accepted to offer some limited program of labor participation in capital ownership in certain industrial sectors. So it actually it helped him in order to regain kind of to reestablish or reconstitute his legitimate base by like giving credit, to the government by implementing some economic reform measures. So it was a country where, like, these kind of economic and political initiatives um, actually came from the opposition, but the credit, went out to the government in order to undercut, this opposition appeal. So even like besides like this kind of divide and rule and negotiated kind of a structure of roles and implementation or responding a little bit to the demands of the opposition in order to undermine their social basis. Um, some other this actually obliged oppositions in order to work from within the institutional framework of the existing institutional framework, but again on the kind of the outsider French as well. Some other fronts or outsider oppositions um, have existed and actually pressured the king or the political regime in order to undertake more kind of political and economic reforms. Um, so these kind of outsider oppositions, the main players are France and trade or labor unions. So the most prominent France are a movement of the 23rd of March. Actually, it was like the legacy or the heritage of the student protest in Casablanca and onwards, or Al-Amam movement. And it was kind of a breakaway faction from the party of progress and socialism, and some other, like, national republican elements, republicans from, like, nationalist element inherited from the nationalist movement, like Mahdi bin Baraka and this kind of radical nationalist tendencies. And but actually, like the France or this type of opposition actually suffered, brutal crackdown and liquidation. Um, but even, like, these outsiders, had a role to play by allowing the regime or giving the pretext, for the regime in order to crack down on moderate, opposition as well. So the regime actually, or the monarchy as institution used even, like, outsider opposition in order to get, some benefits to consolidate the power of the king. And labor unions unions, they have like different relations or different degrees of, like, relation with political parties. Like the most famous ones, like the General Union of Moroccan Workers, they have, like, the trade union is dominated by Istiqlal Party, and the Moroccan Labor Union dominated by the United the National Union for Popular Forces, and the Democratic Labor Confederation by the Socialist Union of Popular Forces. So the focus, actually, their demands on wages and conditions of employment, but they had, like, to play again from within the framework, or the institutional framework, because they are actually vulnerable to kind of the regime policy, because they know quite well that the regime would dismiss them and appoint, others, and put others, in their place. So that's why they had, like, to strike a balance, between challenging, the regimes, and maintaining or asking for more and maintaining what they already had. So it was kind of mutual recognition of boundaries between political opposition, insiders or outsiders, and the king. Actually, it was not like, this kind of insiders and outsiders. The demarcating line is not, like, that clear or that sharp. Because again, like, the organized opposition and this kind of contentious or chaotic or unorganized opposition overlapped, or it had kind of intersection. For example, like students and labor, as I mentioned, they had like strong kind of relations and ties, and they arranged um, or organized some contentious actions, together in order to challenge the regime and to demand for more economic and social reforms or concessions. And the most fierce opposition as well, it's like the national teacher union. And actually it's a part of the Democratic Labor Confederation, the as like a trade union as well. So there is kind of cross-cutting relationship between different political forces that made it very difficult to have like a sharp boundary between insiders and outsiders. And despite the fact that like Morocco has always been like um, depicted as like a very calm kind of and moderate monarchy. um, it had like this kind of occasional disruptive events as like strikes and mobilization circles as kind of annual events. So this kind of aura of calm and like moderation, moderate political opposition, actually usually truncated by these kind of contentious or mobilization circles. Um, so one new events like after Hassan II and under the Muhammad the sixth reign, it was like the emergence of moderate Islamist parties. So it was kind of it's part of like Arabization of educational curricula, and like some sort of using the Arabic language as like one of the one of kind of unifying device, or one element of national identity in Morocco. So it gave rise to like this kind of religious and Islamic sentiments that actually led to the emergence of some Islamist parties. And again, like the regime followed the same strategy by co-opting moderate, opposition or moderate Islamist parties. Most especially, or the most famous one is the Justice and Development Party. And it actually shared kind of power between there was kind of a share of votes, of electoral votes, between the party and the Justice and the Development Party as an new Islamist party, and relatively to the Istiqlal and Istiqlal Party. But the general attitude, it was kind of delusionment with the party politics and occasional eruption of mobilization and political cynicism. And the actually some of like outsider opposition took to the street in order to pressure, to challenge the regime, in order to ask, to put demands for social and economic reforms. And usually the regime accommodated some of these demands in order to de-radicalize these kind of political opposition. So your grades of the movie review are now available on Blackboard, and I'll upload this shortly. And tomorrow, at the most, you will have the lecture on the first lecture on Palestine, and then on Thursday we're going to have our normal one, regular lecture on the second part of the Palestinian issue. Okay, bye.